then some important facts and its consequences, about the struggle that was going on between eclectics and modernists in Brazil by this time, about the importance of this building. Then I start talking about the process of competition and then rejection of the winning project, and then a new commission. Then about this collective process that starts in the new commission of the characters and their post-production. Then I will say something about the evolution of this project. It has some 6 clear steps that I'm going to show, and then finally make some analysis of the building itself. So starting with the context in the world about what was happening that matters for this. We were coming from the end of the First World War, when the world got into the 1929 crisis, and together with the first decades of the development after the Industrial Revolution, it gave birth to the modernism. It was the birth of Bauhaus, Rose, Hitler here, Frankfurt Reich, the Corbusier. These last two particularly very important for this process that I'm going to talk tonight. And in Brazil, we were asked, yes, and this was a kind of architecture that was being done, the machine of living from the Corbusier. And in Brazil, we were passing by a revolution in 1930, when we were leaving what we call the old republic. So that's something quite important for this process. In architecture specifically, what we were living was what I call neo-whatsoever, because we saw by the same time this neo-Gothic, neo-Romantic, neo-Renaissance, neo-Baroque, neo-colonialism, what we called all together in the city, and many times all together in the same building. So it was called eclecticism. This was the kind of architecture that was happening there by then. This is the Municipal Theater of Rio de Janeiro from 1909. That explains also a lot about the undeclared dispute that was going on between Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro to be the tropical Paris. Buenos Aires was creating the widest avenue in the world, and then Rio de Janeiro was creating the most beautiful boulevard in the world by Copacabana Beach. And then Buenos Aires was getting one specific building of Paris and just making exactly a perfect copy of it, and then Rio de Janeiro did this. This is basically a scale model of the Opéra de Paris from Paris. So this was what was going on basically, and then one very important fact happened in 1922. I believe someone in this series of lectures must have talked about this already. There was the Modern Art Week in São Paulo. It was amazingly important for everything that came after it. The unofficial slogan of this Modern Art Week was "To be or not to be." A little joke with the "to be or not to be." To be is the biggest indigenous tribe in Brazil. And the clear message of this Art Week was that we should learn how to be modern and, by the same time, to be Brazilian. So, all the most important artists that there were by then, writers like Mário de Andrade, Oswald de Andrade, painters like these two, Tarsila do Amaral, with here there's a self-portrait of her, and Anita Malfatti. This is her most famous painting, Urapuru. They were considered by the press those crazy people under the extravagant influence of Picasso and his fellows. This was a very important writer, Brazilian writer, writing about them. And Villa-Lobos, who was the most important classical composer ever in Brazil. He actually, in this week, he presented one piece of work that is, until nowadays, considered to be like a second hymn for Brazil, the Guarani. But he did it under a lot of booing by then. And you can see why in this little detail here. If you check his feet, he has one classical shoes, and on the other foot he has flip-flop. And even if he declared later that it was just because of a blister, everybody understood very well that it was not any blister. It was just a clear message of we need to learn our way to be modern. Let's create our own identity. Brazil is a quite young country, so by then it was very much everywhere this strong will to create our own identity. Then there is other two facts that really influenced a lot everything that happened in Brazil last century. That was these two inspiring visits. One by Corbusier in 1929, Tom had just talked a little bit about it, and one that apparently had less consequences, but had also some quite important consequences. Frank Lloyd Wright, he came in 1931. In this photo, we can see him with two essential characters for Brazilian architecture. On his right, so on your left, we have Lucio Costa, which is kind of our Le Corbusier, very similar to him in terms of personality, of an evolving speech, and of political influence and a way of influencing people. You can even see he has the same pose as Le Corbusier. And on the other hand, on his other side, we see Warszawskyk, that was basically who brought modernism to Brazil. They are here in the first modernist house of Rio de Janeiro, by Warszawskyk. So, talking a little bit about these two visits. First, Le Corbusier, when he arrived, there was one very interesting thing, that he flew over Rio in Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's plane, and then he had this vision that Tom just showed of one giant structure snaking around Rio de Janeiro's mountains. It was actually one big road on the top with 15 floors of dwelling below, and that actually brought a lot of consequences, both to Le Corbusier's architecture after this and to Brazilian architecture. So in Le Corbusier's work, we can see, of course, the Opus project that he just showed, which is basically a repositioning of the project in Algiers. And actually, you could say that the Universidade da Educação is basically the same idea, just like a little section of that giant snaking building. Of course, it couldn't have a road on the top because it would be connect nowhere to nowhere, but still a collective space on the top. So still the same idea. And for Brazilian architecture, we can see, you just saw the project of Igor de Vetyemy, which is basically the same as the sketch on the Corbusier to lose. Also, his gesture of marking the city center with the crossing of this building was some years later kind of repeated by Lucio Costa in the creation of the mythic Brasilia, our capital. Also, here some more pictures of the Vetyemy and the other project that Tom also talked about, Gavia. It's the second of those four collective spaces that Vídeo and Portinho were creating. And underneath we have in São Paulo one of the most iconic buildings of São Paulo by Niemeyer, the Copan building. A little bit taller, a little bit shorter, but still the same idea. And Frank Lloyd Wright's visit, we see here some of his influence in Brazil, but actually it's said to have brought much less literal consequences, at least. And one of the funny and curious reasons for that is that by then nobody in Brazil could speak English. The official language we had to speak with the rest of the world was French. So Frank Lloyd Wright himself said that the only guy who could speak English, and because of that became his official translator. Frank Lloyd Wright has had sometimes the impression that he was speaking so enthusiastically and passionately about to translate what he was saying, that he had the impression that the guy was saying something completely different than what he was saying. So it might be because of that. But I personally think that the biggest contribution was in the way that Brazilians modified that dogmatic way of Le Corbusier of seeing modernism, the 5 points, the very hard structure, the machine of living, and I think we Brazilians learned how to adapt that dogmatic architecture to our environment, and this adaptation, volgens mij, is a lot of the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright. So, going on to the next thing, in the 30s we had in Rio de Janeiro also a strong struggle between these neo-whatsoevers that I was telling before and the modernists. And the biggest example of this struggle is these two buildings, basically built by the same time, 1 year of difference of projects and of completion. These are two ministries. The first one here is the Ministry of Finances, and the process in which it happened there was a competition for it. A modernist team won the competition, and the minister, that was very conservative, simply paid the price, threw away the project, and commissioned a very conservative engineer to make this very classical building, very imponent, with big stairs on the front, big Roman columns that don't hold the building. They are not structural, they're just to make this imponent image and make people who are getting in understand that they are so small, they are nothing in front of the state. And quite the same, but in the opposite way, happened with the Ministry of Education and Health. I'm going to start telling that story now. It's the building we're going to see here. But first of all, I would like to help you to understand the importance of it, because it's very often presented as the first modernist building in Brazil. But actually, it was in 1936, so it's pretty clear that it could not be the first modernist building. This is the first modernist house that I just told from Warszawski. Warszawski, first, him and Leno Heavy brought first modernism from Europe to Brazil with words, with a lot of texts, and this was the first time that it was being really translated into architecture. It has some similarities with the process of Hitler here with the Schroeder house, because it's full of fake gestures. It's actually concrete was not possible to be arranged in Brazil yet. This flattened roof that we're seeing is just a wall covering a very traditional ceramic roof. But anyway, this was the first modernist building in 27 by Warszawski. So people say, oh, okay, so the ministry is not the first building in Brazil, but it's the first modernist building in Rio de Janeiro, which is also not true, because the same Warszawski did this other house in Rio de Janeiro in 31. This is the house that Frank Lloyd Wright was there seeing, and by the way, many people say this is one of his biggest inspirations for the Falling Water house, the Kaufmann house that he did right after this. Then people say, okay, it's not the first one in Rio as well, but it is the first public building, modernist building in Brazil, which also cannot be, because Tom already showed you the Parte de Boa Vontade, the goodwill project from Afonso Eduardo Reidy as well, and Gerson Pinheiro, which is from 31, so still 5 years before the project of the Ministry of Education and Health. Then people say, okay, but at least it is the first modernist building in that scale, which is also not true, because there's this building made 1 year before, in 35, by Irmãos Roberto, which is also some monsters of Brazilian modernism. So actually the importance of the Ministry of Education and Health is that it is the first modernist public big-scale building in Rio de Janeiro, which of course doesn't matter at all. This is not the importance of the building. This is just some titles that people try to bring to kind of legitimize the importance of it, but it's really not necessary that. The importance of this building is that it was really the first iconic, completely manifesto building in that scale about modernism.